Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi строева и усияй ужита. Распихитекай под звездам славы, под руком партия и под сердцем кита. Распихитекай под звездам славы, под руком партия и под сердцем кита.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. You'll have to excuse me if my voice is a little hoarse, more hoarse than usual. I was doing rather a lot of chanting yesterday with the CPGBML May Day contingent. So we are here tonight on the 2nd of May, 2024, looking for a truth in an ocean of lies. Let's just say that. Let's hope we can fish successfully this evening. So what we're going to be talking about this evening is the generalized crackdown in the United States, and I'm sure the encampments and the protest encampments here will be cracked down upon by the British government in similar fashion. So going to be looking at propaganda, narratives, state repression, and the question of, well, how truly panicked is the ruling class in the United States and its most immediate allies / vassals, depending upon which definition you want to use of both. So we will begin with our customary roll call through the chat, and I will then move on to the business at hand. So President Jesus says good afternoon, coming to us from the perpetual dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. Albert Roundtree is with us, who I ran into yesterday in the London May Day. Good to have you with us tonight. We have Jay with us from Virginia. Anthony joins us, as does C. Bolt. And we also have Yep X, Putin's shirt. Greetings to you. Gordon Bennett himself. Good evening to you. Banana Bender says good morning from Queensland, already in tomorrow. We have Bilbo One joining us. We have Rob joining us from the wrong side of the Pennines. And Beans is also with us, but is painting socialist balloons. This is interesting. This is the level of creativity of which I am not capable. I don't jest in that either. Art was my worst subject at school. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Dan Lindstrom is with us, as is Luca, who says, evening from the ever more perfidious Albion, where turnout in my local polling station was 16%. Oh, God. Police and crime commissioner elections. If you're not familiar with what Luca is referring to there, in the perpetual joke that is bourgeois politics in Britain, or at least it is a perpetual joke in the modern era, perhaps prior to the 90s, it was perhaps worthy of more serious consideration as an opponent, but now it's just a joke. About 12 years ago, the Conservative Liberal Coalition here introduced the Police and Crime Commissioner post into the way that the police forces in Britain are managed. And essentially, this is a nonsense bureaucratic post which actually got rid of whatever shred of accountability used to be in existence towards policing, which used to come through the local police authority, which used to have elected councillors on it. Now, let's just prefigure anything I'm about to say here by stating the obvious. Look, having a bunch of bourgeois politicians oversee the police on a county level, which is how our police force is organized in England and Wales, that's not going to change the nature of the repressive agents of the state. So let's just get that out of the way straight away. But the laughable thing about these like posts that they've been introducing in Britain, be it citywide mayors or region-wide mayors, for instance, like there's now a mayor of like the East Midlands, a mayor of the West Midlands. I mean, there's a mayor of Greater Manchester, of course, Mr. Andrew Burnham. These are posts that nobody really wanted, and they were presented as like, oh, it's more democracy. It's actually the reverse. And once you learn to interpret these things, you can clearly see what's going on. The mayoral posts have been introduced into Britain over the last 25 years. It was started with the Mayor of London post. I mean, it's just the usual pathetic imitation of the American system that our politicians here, the bourgeois politicians, routinely engage in. But with the London mayor, Greater Manchester mayor, they control pretty decent sized budgets and have quite a good degree of authority over certain functions, such as the Manchester mayor, for instance, the Greater Manchester, the NHS budget for the region. Not that most people in Greater Manchester know that, because it's not very well advertised. They also have a certain authority over housing, transport, anything that could be like managed on a city region level. And these posts, of course, replace or subsume some of the powers of like what used to be back in the early to mid 80s, like a Greater Manchester wide council. And the Tories got rid of region-wide councils in like Merseyside and Greater Manchester and Greater London, because these were becoming troublesome in terms of the things they wanted to do. And Labour, of course, didn't restore them when they got in. So and this will feed into what I'm saying later about the protests in the United States. What you see probably from the 60s onwards is a relentless reverse of like any meaningful, well, even partial democratic reforms that could have got in the way of things that the ruling class wanted to achieve were reversed. And they were often reversed, of course, in the name of greater democracy and accountability, because, of course, you can't go out and say, we want to restore rule purely by the bourgeois and render your votes completely meaningless. You can't say that. So you've got to massage the message in various different ways. But what we have actually witnessed in the imperial core countries is a 60-year plus process of like the democratic reforms that the working class had won, in our case, in the case of perfidious Albion, the first election where all men and women could vote above the age of 21 was 1929. So that was when the final property qualifications were dropped for women, and when the age of voting was equalized. That's 1929. That's less than 100 years ago. So then you have, of course, the welfare capitalist period immediately after World War II. But of course, then you have the crisis, which begins in the middle of the 60s. And after that, democratic reforms that have been won by the working class start to get reversed. Slowly at first, but then with gathering pace as the working class suffers more defeats. So in reality, in Britain, and this will be analogous inside the United States as well, you have the period of democratic reform ends definitively by the mid-60s. So in reality, it was less than 40 years that there was this advancing period, or this period of advancing democratic rights to a certain extent for the working class. Things like in our example, using Britain, legal aid and things like that, which is of course public funds which are made available so that those accused of crimes can actually pay for or have paid for them a decent legal defense. And that's been under siege for a long time. The accountability for the police is one of those democratic reforms, though that was always shaky. They used to have much more democratic control back in the 19th century before the working class could vote, where the old watch committees used to actually oversee and have direct control over the county-wide police forces to a much greater extent. They've been bureaucratizing that away ever since, of course, the working class won the vote. So what we see here with Luca's example of a 16% turnout for a bullshit post, Well, that's just the sort of the fag end, shall we say, of this 60-year-long reversal of the limited democratic reforms that the working class were able to winkle out of, I should say, the bourgeoisie. They've been reversing them relentlessly for decades, of course, all in the name of greater democracy. Perhaps there is an element of truth in there, or an inadvertent element of truth. They mean greater democracy for them. A restoration of what bourgeois democracy should truly mean, if you're a bourgeois, which is democracy for you and your class, and everybody else's choices are made increasingly irrelevant. So we'll come back to the reactionary turn, or the ultra-reactionary turn, since the 90s later on. But no, if there's anything of note that comes up in these local elections, I will cover it tomorrow. I doubt there will be. Good evening to Roddy, who has joined us, and Jawad, who says, "Evening, comrades. I must say I was massively starstruck by Alex yesterday on the May Day march." Well. It's the flat cap I was wearing. It has an overpowering effect on everybody. But it was good to see you, comrade, yesterday, and all the other comrades who came along to the London May Day march. I'll comment more on that later on. But good to have you with us tonight. Colchester Ian, who says, "Good evening, comrades," and I say good evening back to you. We have Jenny, who joins us. Good evening, comrades. Miss Jenny, music teacher in exile in Manhattan, detained twice in the last 2 weeks, born and raised in apartheid South Africa. The struggle must continue. As you imply in your comment, Jenny, the struggles really are all one when it comes down to it. The center of it all is US imperialism, and it is to that center that we will turn in just a moment. Davey joins us, as does J9B, as does Comrade Ian Foster. Good to see you here tonight. And Slava joins us. Good to have you here. Todd joins us from America, from the good old-fashioned USA. Jay says, "Greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa. Good to have you here." Dr. Fu Manchu says, "Good evening from EU Capo, Germany." And where are we now? Heidi, good evening to you. Muzzle Paint is with us from the shadow of the heart of darkness, currently staffed by Biden's cronies. Well, if there's one thing the last week has proved, it's that our case that we have made here on this channel, and many other Marxist-Leninists have made over the last few years, is that Biden and Trump truly are a bipartisan endeavor when it comes to anything that matters. Both of them support the state crackdown on the student protests, and both of them support the deployment of, shall we say, fascist mobs against the student uprisings. And that is a truly glorious and shall we say, tear-jerking bipartisan moment. Yu Wan says, "Just saw an interview with Max Blumenthal where he mentioned student organizing at Columbia goes back a decade and alumni remain involved as advisors." Interesting. Mayday was filled with news, says Yepex, who's joined us. Good to have you here. Beiju, good evening to you, comrade. Good to see you yesterday. And Tim Gray has joined us. And Frank joins us from California. Good to have you here. We have Boyo joining us from London. Martin joining us from the US of A. We have Michael joining us from Ireland. I am not even going to try and pronounce the Irish Gaelic you've written down there, mate. Sorry. I might be descended from Irishmen, but I sure as hell can't read it or pronounce it. And if I do that, I'm going to get arrested for a hate crime because the pronunciation is going to be so fucking bad. But good to have you with us, mate. Spurious Furious has joined us. Jenny has joined us and has not a pacifist. Gordon Bennett says, "The government are portraying anyone supportive of Palestinian rights as a terrorist supporter. Even the slogan from the river to the sea has been criminalized." Yeah, I mean, we'll come to that later on in terms of our discussion of why the ruling class are getting themselves worked up into a frenzy. Otis joins us. Boyo says, "I find it amazing the massive media apparatus holding up this illusion of democracy. This lead up the election and then the result." Warning, leftist nonsense, leftist satire joins us and says, "Hi," and I say hi back to him. Jeremy Turner joins us from New York, and David Greenwood is here as well. Greetings to you. So I'll come to any questions that comrades have later on, but I will handle this from Putin's shirt first of all. who say, you say the center is US imperialism. I feel like there isn't any center. I certainly can't see how anyone in DC is in charge of anything. Isn't it really transnational capital at the center? You've asked me a direct question, so I'll give you a direct answer. No. There's no such thing as truly transnational capital. There's corporations that operate in many different localities, but they all have a center. And that center, if you look at the ownership structure, usually tracks back to the centers of imperialism, the good old G7, with the US at the center. Now, I'm guessing from the comments you've made in the past that you are a citizen of the United States, and this isn't just a US theory that kicks around. This is the idea that there is no center to imperialism is a theory that's been kicking around for a long time. It's false. You look at the biggest corporations in the world, from the imperialist, who have their origins in imperialist countries. Their ownership structure still traces back to the imperialist countries. Yes, it's more diffused these days between different various ownership vehicles, but the center of the system is in the United States. The center of, we spent a whole episode talking about this the other night. The center is US imperialism. The center is DC. It's not that no one's in charge. It's that the system is becoming more erratic and more unstable due to the fact that the US domestic economy has been in stagnation for 16 years now. So there's an extended crisis, but the center of it all is US imperialism. It's US imperialism which sets the global trade rules, or has done for a very long time. It's the fact that their control over that is being threatened now by mostly, in the economic sense, the rise of China, but also the role that the Russians are playing, and also that the way in which capital flows go. You look at where the capital flows into and out of. It flows into and out of and is processed through New York, London, Paris, Germany to a certain extent. But it's the G7 nations, principally those four I've just mentioned, like USA, France, Germany, to a certain extent, Japan. Your country and mine were at the center of this system. We, to a large extent, our ruling class created it. Your ruling class took it over. And over the last 30 years, they have made themselves, or tried to make themselves, the center of a truly global system at which they sit at the middle of. Now, it might feel like the system's misfiring at the moment, because it is, but they're still very much in charge of it. And I would urge everybody watching this to consider it that way. Without US imperialism, the rest of the imperialist system falls apart. Without US imperialism's ability to militarily project itself and also to enforce these global rules of trade, which always act in the favor of the corporations which are ultimately registered in and controlled from the United States, without US imperialism's power, then none of this imperialist system, which the US sits at the center of and the rest of the G7 nations act within and are the beneficiaries of, then there is no imperialism anymore. Transnational capital doesn't really exist. All of the imperialists, it all traces back to the imperialist countries. Like we had a trend in the 90s and the early 2000s, in the peak period of globalization before the collapse of 2007 to 2008, where the ideologists of the imperialist system tried to portray they tried to say it wasn't imperialism anymore. They definitely tried to do that, but they would try and portray capitalism as having gone beyond the boundaries of the nation state. This is when the term transnational corporation came into vogue in academic literature. I think like 80s, 90s, 2000s, 90s and 2000s especially. And what they tried to say was that the corporation was now bigger than the state. That the gigantic corporations were now more powerful than the individual states, and that they imposed themselves on states, and the nation state was now powerless to resist the rule of the corporation. There's whole films made about this, featuring Noam Chomsky, no less. But this is false. This was academic hackery, paid for largely by the imperialist powers themselves. Behind globalization stood the interests of the imperialist powers. What is globalization fundamentally? It's a process by which which kicks off probably in the 60s and 70s as the crisis of the imperialist countries necessitates the outflows of capital and deindustrialization. We go into the 90s, the post-Soviet period, after the collapse of 89 to 91. And what globalization becomes is the systematic annihilation of all barriers to capital movement. And again, who's at the center of that? United States, US imperialism, British imperialism, the other Western European countries to a slightly lesser degree. And those are the countries which are breaking down all the barriers and trying to implement this global system where they can move capital anywhere, draw labor from anywhere, and do it under the guise that this is now moved beyond the nation state. See, that what your question reflects, and I'm not saying this to have a go at you, I'm just saying that these are contradictions which are and problems are caused by bourgeois academia that give us the wrong ideas. They tried to say that the nation state was irrelevant, that imperialism had moved beyond the nation state. It was now, there's a whole book several books, in fact, by people like Hart and Negri and others who argued that imperialism is beyond any nation state now. And again, this is all false. This was all stuff that was ultimately coming from the imperialist countries to disguise the fact that the wonderful period of globalization was just a particularly hyper-aggressive and brutal dawn of a new period of imperialist domination. They thought it would last for another century, hence the title of one of their projects, Project for a New American Century. But it all fell apart, really, in less than 20 years. Because again, even with this new period of brutish imperialism, where they were able to impose themselves everywhere, almost everywhere, they couldn't dig themselves out of the hole they were already in, of the crisis that had been there for, well, arguably since 1914, in its renewed form since about 1965 to 66. So I disagree with the way you're framing the issue at hand there. And I disagree with the concept of transnational capital, or everything traces back to the imperialist countries. If you again go down the, I think it's the Forbes list of the biggest corporations. You got some big state-owned companies on there, principally from China, but all of the Western ones, they might portray themselves as having shareholders from here, there, and everywhere, but in reality, the bulk of the ownership structure lies within the imperialist countries. So, Munis, hello. Banana Bender says, is the SNP infiltrated? The SNP is, if you're not familiar with who they are, they're the Scottish National Party. You know what? I'm going to save your question because I want to get to this campus protest thing. So I will come back. I will do British politics special tomorrow, and I will cover the SNP question then. So Banana Bender, remind me of the question if I forget about it tomorrow. Zuleika, hello to you. Where are we? Warning leftist nonsense, leftist satire says that you're from Poland, apparently. Well, greetings to you. I can't speak Polish, but I might. If you come back, I'll learn how to say hello in Polish. How's that up for a deal for you? Tomas joins us, and Morgan joins us. Trinity College Dublin fined their student union €214,000 for disrupted protests. Can only see it galvanizing protests. You're probably right. I was over there myself quite recently. Seemed to be that there was at least an enthusiasm amongst some layers of the students there for at least learning about Marxism. So it seems that there is a radicalization underway. Thomas says the Gaza situation is waking a lot of people up on new American imperialism. That's true. Gordon Bennett asks, does America control Israel or does Israel control America? Well, tell you what, mate, we'll get to that. Okay, our Polish friend says, this is a very good channel because you speak slowly. I can more understand than other channels. Well, wait till I get to the Alex Jones impression. Right. Okay. So I'm going to go and move to the question of the campus protest. Now, I would recommend, if you're looking for a rundown of the various provocations of the Zionists, I would recommend, of course, watching Max Blumenthal's exhaustive work on this. He's probably one of the single best sources for chronicling the provocations of the Zionists in the campus protests. But it's worth reminding ourselves that this has all blown up over the last really 2 weeks or so, though of course the organizing roots of it in the United States go a lot deeper than that. But what I wanted to talk about tonight is like why it has produced an immediate and extreme reaction from the authorities inside the United States, and it'll produce an extreme response from everywhere as well inside the imperial core countries. So the reason why that this has been immediately jumped on and it's escalated to the point where they're deploying basically fascist mobs to go and beat up the students and try and intimidate them, or create a situation where the police in New York or Los Angeles and others managed to, of course, claim there was a riot and then send in the cops to batter people. Well, this was, of course, an engineered situation. I would imagine that if you actually found out who was in these mobs, you'll find that they've got some sort of link back to the American security state somewhere along the line. Maybe some of them are the same characters who you see turning up at so-called patriot protests in the United States. But again, we come back to the question of like, well, why did they react immediately with a militarized response? And why did they not, for instance, take a more, what would be regarded by a sensible bourgeois as a more sensible line, which is to engage the protest leadership in drawn out, meaningless negotiations, which are ultimately going to go nowhere, and which are designed to essentially placate the protest leadership, try to co-opt it, try to get it to cooperate with university management and the representatives of the American state. So this is the way that some more, shall we say, patient and sensible bourgeois rulers would respond, rather than just sending in the heavy mob straight away with batons and guns and sending in like gangs of fascists to attack the encampments. So why go almost immediately towards the heavy option? And I think that you have to understand this in a slightly broader context. Like the sensible option would be taken by a bourgeois that was much more secure in its power. This is not the case in the United States or in Britain. What's going on now is obviously, clearly, a culmination of many decades of decay in the United States. I would argue in the US case going back to the middle 1960s. And this manifests itself, as I was talking about earlier, with regard to the attack on even the mildest of democratic reforms. This has escalated since the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the shall we say, the first phase of the existence of socialist states. We are perhaps going into or preparing for the second phase now. So what you have is rather than the US ruling class being magnanimous in its victory and easing off on the anti-democratic reforms, the anti-democratic attacks, they actually doubled down on them. If you notice, in both the United States and in Britain, you get more and more militarization and securitization going on after 1990 to 91 than you even did before that. So as the premier threat to the power of the imperialists essentially is killed by, as we all know, revisionist treachery from within, and as the working class in Britain and in the United States is killed off in terms of its leadership is killed off, its industries are destroyed, the working class is fundamentally changed in terms of the industries it works in, and we haven't recovered the level of militancy that will be required yet to build a real fight back against the devastating defeats of the 80s and early 1990s. So as all of that is going on, the ruling class should be feeling more secure, given that the prime threat to its rule, the domestic working class, has suffered a devastating defeat nationally and internationally with the destruction of what is referred to in some literature as actually existing socialism. But no, they continue to go down the line of more and more repression. They continue to enact more and more anti-democratic measures. They continue, in our case, in the British case, to press for more and more ultra-reactionary, like so-called anti-terrorist legislation, building up the powers of the secret police forces in Britain, militarizing the police. I mean, we haven't gone anywhere like as far as the United States ruling class has, but we're getting there. So why do all of this is the question, when you apparently have won the Cold War, defeated the domestic working class, you have completely pushed out even the mildest alternative points of view inside the bourgeois political system are completely dead. You've won, apparently, but they don't act like they are secure in their victory. They act more and more paranoid. And if you look at the history of legislation in Britain, you see, again, more and more anti-terrorist legislation being passed, starting pre-9/11. So this starts in 1999 with one of the, to 2000, with what was at the time a quite notorious terrorism act that was justified by our dear departed leader, Tony Blair. He's not dead. He just, we all wish he was. He was justifying it at the time by saying it was about animal rights extremists, which is a bit of a fucking laugh when you consider like the Animal Liberation Front as was. I think they did like 2 or 3 actions involving explosives, I think. It would be interesting to see the extent of state involvement in that as a provocation as well. But like they planted a few weed killer and sugar bombs, I think, and then the state used that as an excuse to bring in even more repressive legislation. And of course, after the 9/11 incident, the whole thing kicks into overdrive. More and more powers for the security services, endless powers for the security services to send people to basically re-education facilities, and endless powers for the state to spy on literally anything. Now, you might say, if you're taking an analysis which says, oh, well, this is about a security bureaucracy trying to just endlessly get itself a bigger budget, there's elements of truth in that. If you take the analysis that a lot of these things are down to different areas of the state competing with each other over budgetary considerations, well, as I say, there's elements of truth in that, but it's not the overarching truth. And the overarching truth is that regardless of their supposed victory in the late 80s, early 90s, the ruling class has their position, despite appearing secure in the 90s and early 2000s, was actually becoming more and more insecure. Now, I covered a lot of this on a previous broadcast a few months ago entitled The 30-Year Crisis. You can find it in the back catalogue on the YouTube channel, or the audio is up on Patreon as well. But the point about I was making in that video, and I will just make it again quickly now, is that what you actually got over the last 30 years was a manifestation of the fact that the ruling class did not win in 89 to 91. They got a win by default because the other side collapsed under the weight of, well, treachery and contradictions that could not be easily overcome. And it gave the ruling class in the United States a gigantic victory in terms of their ability to go anywhere, destroy all elements that were left of socialism in Europe, and that were left of the left nationalist regimes in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, elements that existed in Southeast Asia as well, and to engage in a gigantic amount of looting all the way around the world. And despite that, though, it didn't secure them in the way that they would perhaps have wanted. I mean, that's why you get plans such as the Project for the New American Century, with the idea being that if they could keep complete control over the oil reserves of the biggest oil reserves in the Middle East, and also strategically position themselves so that they could have a permanent advantage over both Russia and China in terms of placement of military installations in West Asia, then that would secure for them another century of American dominance. And that didn't work either. And again, to reiterate a point, like, the truth is that they haven't overcome the US ruling class, that is, the the problems that began in the 1960s, which are, of course, related to the US as an imperialist power, which is that capitalism reaches a certain point, becomes, well, you see the merger of industrial and money capital to make finance capital. You see gigantic monopolies emerge. And then these monopolies, of course, seek to establish a higher rate of profit by exporting capital elsewhere in the world and deindustrializing inside the imperial core countries. That's a very shorthand way of me explaining it out. There's some elements of Lenin's theory of imperialism, but this is what's going on inside the United States. So they did not win in 1989 to 91, not truly. Their system didn't win. Our system, the socialist system, suffered a defeat for reasons we've gone into before. And they were able to get a boost for themselves for a little while. But if you look at what happens in the immediate period after 1991, you get a decade of growth under, let's use the US as the example country here, under Clinton. And then you get a series of crises under George W. Bush, which culminate in the gigantic recession of 2007 to 2008. And then, of course, it runs under Obama until around about 2010. So what they actually get from this great opportunity presented to them of the collapse of the USSR is about a decade of uninterrupted looting of almost the entire world, with China still able to set its own terms, Russia a chaotic mess ruled over by compradors for a while. But this period, of course, is in reality not that long in the grand scheme of things. So it comes to an abrupt end, arguably in 2007. Arguably the exposure of the weaknesses of American imperialism in Iraq happens earlier. So this is the way in which I want to present this, which is that what you see manifesting in terms of the ever-increasing paranoia of the ruling class is rooted in actual fact in a long-term weakness. They know that they are, well, some of them know and understand or feel on some level that they are in actual fact much weaker than they appear to be, that their position is much weaker than it appears to be, that they keep trying all these schemes to try and secure their dominance, the dominance internally over the working class and to a large extent over the petty bourgeoisie as well in the United States. And it's not quite working. Their schemes at perpetual domination overseas, though they create a lot of blood and savagery, and in certain cases, the restoration of slave trading, such as in Libya, and there are now credible rumors coming out of Ukraine that slave trading has been introduced there under the period of American control, shall we say. I'll talk more about that when I've done a bit more research on it. But the point is that this ever-increasing ruling class paranoia isn't a modern invention. It didn't flash into existence over the last 5-6 years. It's been increasing year on year since the early 1990s, partially because they feel on some level that their position is a lot weaker than it appears, but also because they feel some of them feel as if they have no need to keep up the appearances anymore. They've won, so they think. So, well, we might as well stick the boot in and make sure that these workers never revolt again and that no one ever around the world has a chance to challenge us again. Well, that's all gone wrong internationally. And it's going wrong domestically as well. So the savagery which they respond to this challenge now, even though, of course, we'll come to the limitations of these campus protests later on, but the way they respond in such a nakedly reactionary way, that they are prepared to use fascist gangs to smash up these protests and brutalize people, that they're prepared to make themselves look ridiculous to any critically minded person. You don't have to be a Marxist. You just have to be able to look at this in a vaguely critical fashion, even just using conventional principled liberal stances. And you see Eric Adams, the idiot mayor of New York City and his police commissioner, on stage, on TV, going, well, we had to do this because of it wasn't Adams, actually. It was that wretched academic that Max Blumenthal exposed as being both a professor at, I believe it was Columbia, and also like an advisor to the New York Police Department's anti-terrorist unit, who said, oh, well, they were using terrorist language. And you see like CNN saying, oh, this was these were pro-Hamas protests. You see like ultra-reactionary senators like Tom Cotton and people like that saying it as well. And echoing the talking points that come partially from the Israeli regime and partially from the think tank world, are saying, oh, well, all these people were Hamas Nazis, or they were in the pay of Iran, or the Ayatollah Khamenei himself is directing them around the place. It's a familiar set of talking points that they're using that are, at one level, ridiculous pieces of propaganda. And on another level, it's like they're cycling through these narratives and they keep adding to them. And again, that comes back, that we have to take that back and look at it a bit deeper as well. Because like, why is it that they keep saying, well, all these people are Nazis over and over again? You saw it not just from Biden, or I don't know if Trump said that, but various other characters have echoed a talking point that Netanyahu uses quite a lot. Rishi Sunak, of course, our own dear beloved prime minister, said that in his ridiculous speech in response to George Galloway's election. So why do they keep coming back to this Nazi talking point? Is it just because this is something that is cooked up in Tel Aviv to justify themselves? Well, there's a little bit of truth in that, but there's a deeper meaning as well. If you dig further, which is that the constant use of the Nazi insult. I mean, God knows the American and the British left are guilty of throwing this word around with an extreme amount of, shall we say, a cavalier attitude to it. And the ruling class, of course, use it in their propaganda constantly. I mean, they back in the early 1980s, they were calling Arthur Scargill a fascist. You know, they in Parliament in the late 70s, you used to get debates when the National Front, which, if you're not familiar with them, they were quite a big, decently sized fascist organization that were operating in Britain in the late 70s and early 80s, who did have quite a degree of success, certainly in London, to a certain extent in Manchester and some of the other cities as well. And in Parliament at the time, when there was brawls on the street between anti-fascists and fascists, some Labour MPs were standing up and saying, we need to stop both the fascists and the red fascists. So there's this method goes back a long way of like accusing communists and others who are much more associated with revolutionary theories or with working class organizations of actually being fascists. I mean, it became a catch-all term of abuse post World War II. So why is that? And that partially this is because of the cartoonish way that World War II is understood. And this is, of course, what we've talked about many times before. Of course, we don't get the real history of World War II in this country or in the United States, because if we did, then it would lead us to revolutionary conclusions. But throwing the term Nazi around, it has utility for the ruling class because of the cartoonish way that Nazism is presented. It's just presented as simply, if you believe the Netanyahu narrative, it's just bad, shouty people who hate Jews. That's like his cartoonish version of it. The slightly more developed version of it is basically like anybody who can attract a large crowd, anybody who can actually put a string of sentence together on a public stage, anybody who does any kind of mass politics. That's the way that like the liberal bourgeois think about this. Any kind of mass politics to them is fascism. Now, the more reactionary bourgeois will say it's communism, and they're perhaps a little bit more honest in this respect. But this is why they use the term Nazi constantly. It's because it's been instilled in the public's imagination through 1,000 or perhaps 10,000 different films, books, comics even, that the Nazi just means jackbooted authoritarian, or like just a sort of knuckle dragger who wants to throw all Jews into a death camp. And that cartoon vision of Nazism, which again has only a tangential relationship with the actual realities of Nazism, That's drummed into all of us in the West from the moment that we're born, the moment we start absorbing media. The cartoon image of the Nazi is pounded into us by the system, so that when they use the word, it's there in our minds and it triggers like a sort of automated response of disgust. That's why they pound these distorted meanings into us. They hammer them into our imaginations, into our subconscious, so that when they use the trigger word, it will trigger the reaction of disgust. So that's why they're doing it. They tried to do the same thing with Islamism. That's what all of this was really, well, a lot of this was about, using this term Islamic fundamentalist, Islamist, terrorist, when they say it in such a way as to conjure up the image of the terrorist as the bearded Middle Eastern or North African fanatic who can't be reasoned with, the wild, irrational outside force that needs to be destroyed. That's the way they wanted to use the term Islamism. It's meant, again, like the way they've constructed the figure of the Islamist over the last 20 to 25 years, but certainly since 9/11, is to have it as this scary outside force, which is, banging on the walls of Fortress Europe, to quote a line by Asian Dub Foundation. And it's going to get in and it's going to perhaps destroy the garden, and therefore it needs to be blown apart by the air forces of the collective West. It needs to be ruthlessly suppressed. So this is, again, like the reason they put these cartoonish understandings of these words into your mind, into our subconscious, is to trigger the disgust response when they use them against people. When they use the term Nazi, it's meant to just trigger an unthinking response out that comes straight from your subconscious mind out in, you think, oh my God, horrible, must be bad. Don't think about it. Same with Islamist. It's not meant to make you think. It's meant to just trigger an automatic reaction of disgust that will then ready you for whatever repressive action is to follow. Because if this person's a Nazi and the Nazi is the absolute worst thing you can be, then, well, whatever we do to them's got to be good, right? And of course, it takes a while to deprogram yourself from that. And then once you've learned that in actual fact, fascism is inherent to the bourgeois system, is inherent to the bourgeoisie themselves, that it comes from the bourgeoisie and they frequently employ the services of the fascists, or that the kind of Islamic fundamentalist they want you to think of when they use the word Islamist, well, he's actually somebody who they employ on a fairly regular basis. They employ their services on a regular basis. Once you discover that, then you crack open the entire propaganda system. But for the purposes of our discussion here, we're talking about why they use these words, why they present them in such a cartoonish fashion, why it's presented to you in a way that just hammers it into your mind so you're never meant to think about it. Again, these words are there to buried deep inside our minds, to when they use them as trigger words, they're meant to get you ready to agree to anything that they want. So this is why they use them. This is why they call 18, 19-year-old students who are, if nothing else, they have an understanding of anti-imperialism. It might not be a complete and worked out understanding, but it's an understanding. And building their protest accordingly. They are meant to think of them as Nazis. So it's not something, this is not new. They've done this before. They tried to portray Arthur Scargill, a communist trade union leader in Britain, as a Nazi. This is something that they did. In fact, the Murdoch press back in the 80s actually had one of its printing presses stopped after the printers refused to print a front page of the Sun that compared Arthur Scargill to Hitler. So this is not a new thing. They've done this many times before. It's just now it's escalated and it's becoming more and more strident and shrill and hysterical as the system weakens. And so this leads us into a consideration of, well, is the system weakening? So why are they panicking in such a way over student demonstrations, which, again, like the system can absorb student demonstrations, or at least it would be able to were it stronger. The reason why they're getting so panicked over this in the United States is the I think the bourgeois have felt for a while that they're losing control of the situation. I mean, this is behind the panic over Trump, which was, of course, a panic over nothing, given that their main objection to him is one of language. He's all in with Biden on defending the settler colonial project in Israel to the last man and battering anybody over their head who disagrees with it. But the feeling of panic that they had after 2015, in particular, in the bourgeoisie of the collective West, was that they could feel their legitimacy draining away. It wasn't that we, the communists, were suddenly a mass presence within the working class again. It wasn't that the working class was raising itself to new levels of class consciousness. There was some improvements there, but it was that they could feel their power draining. They could feel it internationally because they couldn't. They realized that they'd lost control of the situation with regard to Russia. They were facing a China that was clearly stepping out of what they thought was the carefully designed rules they had set for it. And this, of course, leads to the ruling class's feelings of insecurity. So this is part of the reason, a big part of the reason why they respond to everything now with brute force. I mean, you can see this in the United States now. You can see it also, when I said I'd come back to this, in a place like France, which, in fairness, has always had a tradition of an ultra-violent, very, very dangerous fascistic police force. I mean, look back to the early 1960s and the killing of up to 200 Algerians by the Paris police. Nothing particularly new in their actions, but they have got decidedly more violent and brutish, even by those standards, in recent years. Think of the killing of many people during the Yellow Vest protests, and you'll see what I mean. And again, it comes back to the fact that the ruling class are faced with not insoluble problems, but very, very difficult problems. So and let's go back to the United States example again. Having outsourced so much of its manufacturing base, it's now faced with the fact that not only has it failed thus far to subdue an important target for it in the form of Russia, it's also faced with the fact that their regime change attempts, their interventions attempted in China aren't working. It's also faced with the fact that in the Sahel and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, rebellions against neocolonialism have returned. So its position globally is shaky. Its position, the US ruling class's position domestically, is getting more shaky, because even though class consciousness in the United States, I would argue, if Americans want to disagree with this, be sure to argue the case. I would argue that the class consciousness of the American worker has perhaps improved slightly in recent years, but it's not improved to the extent that we're back in the 1930s again. But it now, because the ruling class's position now is more insecure than it has been for a long time, its crisis is much deeper. It doesn't actually take a great step forward in working class consciousness to render them paranoid, because, and this is an important realization, the level of increase in class consciousness doesn't need to bring us immediately to the level of like the mass sit-down strikes in the United States of the 30s in the car industry to make a weaker, less capable, more crisis-riven ruling class, even than back in the 1930s to a certain extent. It's the institutions have become less legitimate in the eyes of the masses. So it doesn't take much of a disturbance now to reduce them to a panic. Back in the 1930s in the United States, despite the depth of the crisis and of course clear questions of legitimacy arising towards the American state, you had, of course, a degree of energy within the US ruling class that was still vital enough to actually pull it through the crisis. So you had a lot of capable leaders of the US bourgeoisie back in the 1930s. Roosevelt was the chief amongst them, but there were many others in his administration and around it who were very capably, from their class's point of view, managed that crisis to a successful conclusion. Ultimately, they were helped by World War II, but again, they managed their way through that crisis. Now, what do you have? Biden, Trump, the various characters that dwell within the Biden administration or the potential Trump administration, none of these are anything like the same level of even like Lyndon Johnson's cabinet. As the system degenerates, the abilities of the characters within it degenerate along with it. Like a degenerated system will replicate degenerated rulers in the end. Again, consciousness lags behind material reality, but now we're at the point where the degeneration of the American and the British system has been going on for quite some time now. We're into the second decade of it, halfway through the second decade of it. So what's being produced is the political leadership and institutional leadership, which is if not completely incapable, then paranoid, twitchy, rather very short-sighted, obsessed with image over substance, and desperate to just lie or repress its way out of the situation. But material reality has caught up with them. And the material reality in this case, to draw it right back to the Israel question, comes in the form of the deep crisis of the Zionist enterprise, which, again, like it should have been, in theory, easy for them to crush the forces of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, but they can't. Even by the admissions of former and serving Israeli senior officers, they haven't. There's now talk in Hebrew media of potential mutinies in certain army units because they fear going in on the ground in Rafah. They fear that it will be a mass casualty event for them. They've been driven out of certain areas in Gaza because of the level of resistance and the level of casualties that they've taken. The Israeli society is not a stable entity, as we've discussed many times. They've been outmatched by the Iranians, who've shown that their very expensive missile defense system doesn't work, or it works in terms of shooting down a bunch of very cheap Iranian drones and old cruise missiles, but the Iranians have missile systems that could easily do a lot of damage to Israel, and they've made the point quite forcefully that they could do it, but they would prefer not to. They would prefer that the Palestinians get on with the business of liberating themselves, and that they stand and support them, if not in the background, then at a certain distance. So Israeli society is in a deep and existential crisis. And to reiterate a point we've made here many times, again, the purpose of Israel is to sit in the Middle East and create as much chaos, disorder, and violence as possible, along with, of course, the regimes of the Arab compradors, who are also beholden largely to mostly Washington, partially London, maybe partially Paris as well, but nowhere near to the same extent. If Israel goes down in flames, then that means that the comprador regimes in the Middle East will follow it shortly afterwards. It'll unleash a wave of disruption and revolutionary potential across what is more properly called West Asia. And that will spell either a severe damage or the end of American, British, French, and more broader European influence in West Asia. It'll be the end of it'll be the end of Britain, certainly, and the British ruling class's abilities to influence things there, their ability to dominate the markets and resources of those areas. And it'll probably be the end of the US empire in that region as well, which will be severely damaging to US imperialism as an entity. It'll be severely damaging to the global reserve currency status of the US dollar, which is, of course, already coming into question. And so, again, let's go back. Why are the British and the United States ruling class so desperate to preserve Israel? Because if Israel goes, so does a gigantic chunk of US imperialism. It'll be the end of British imperialism. It'll be that damaging for them. If you look at how much the Arab comprador regimes have sunk into the city of London and into buying a lot of things in and around London over the last 40 to 50 years, you can see that what a crucial role that relationship plays with British imperialism. If they lose their chief disruptive influence in the Middle East, which is the Zionist state, then it's good night for the British Empire and a severe damage to US imperialism. And that will create a gigantic crisis within Britain, and it'll possibly become existential for the British ruling class, and may possibly shortly afterwards present existential issues to the American ruling class. If they lose the ability to dominate West Asia, that's a huge problem for them. And so this, to go back to the purposes of our program here, this is why they're so desperate to crush any and all resistance to the policies of the American state with regard to their unending support for the Zionist entity. Anything, again, partially fueled by the other factors we've spent time talking about tonight, but mostly this comes down to the fact that this is an existential problem for US imperialism. Israel goes down, the American and British presence in West Asia will follow it shortly afterwards. And the system as it stands now, being in now its 16th year of crisis, arguably longer, a 16th year of its modern crisis, that they can't take that. And so this is an existential question. And it is an existential question for US imperialism, which is why, of course, the two candidates competing for the big chair in the White House are both all in on repressing these protests, maybe for a little bit of slightly different reasons. Biden would be all in on repressing them, even if he had all his marbles. In fact, he might have done it even sooner and with more brute force. Trump is certainly all in on it. And this is the way in which we have to reckon with this now. This is existential for the US-led imperialist system. And therefore, the students are going to get beaten up and arrested and intimidated and have their their ability to finish their college degrees thrown out the window. They're going to get you got US senators going on TV demanding that they be expelled. So this is, again, this is a crisis point. Now, I want to address the question of whether these protests were ever likely to succeed in their demands, because their demands are quite interesting in terms of getting the universities to divest from interests in the U.S. defense sector and or direct interests in Israel. So I think there was I read that Columbia University has like a campus in Jerusalem, and of course extensive links with the U.S. Department of Defense, with the military-industrial complex. The students here in Manchester have raised similar demands with regards to the University of Manchester's involvement with the defense sector in this country. Now, are those demands going to succeed? Well, in my opinion, if the student protests remain isolated, then the state can still repress them. The state is in a crisis, but it's still got the ability to chuck all these students or the main activists in prison, to intimidate them, to brutalize them. It's still got the ability to do that. And student protests, even though they can be inspiring and can reveal a lot of contradictions, I've been to many when I was a student and immediately afterwards. And though they've got a lot of energy and they raise a lot of expectations, it's quite easy for the state to isolate and repress them most of the time. When it becomes a real problem for the state is when a student protest kicks off something much larger. And that's what happened, for instance, in Paris 1968, which is where you got that student revolt with all the contradictions that are there, which we can go into at another time. But let's just use it as an example for now. When you got a student revolt, which the state attempted to repress, but which then triggered a gigantic general strike across France, which that is what it caused de Gaulle to panic and seek the assistance of the military leaders, who some of whom, he had to strike a bargain with them to release their old comrades who tried to assassinate him previously. It was the general strike of the working class that panicked the French ruling class. So this is the important thing when in considering a student protest. If a student protest kicks off a wider outbreak of working class rebellion in support of or related to that student protest, then not only does the protest stand a chance of meeting some of it or getting some of its demands possibly met, though I would argue in this case the only way to properly meet them would be to dismantle US imperialism itself, but that if it kicks off something much wider, then it can act as an ignition point. If it remains isolated and the state can essentially repress it without having to deal with outbreaks of rebellion elsewhere, then the state can still do that. But a lot of these students are now going through a process of radicalization, because for many of them, if they're like 18, 19, 20, it's the first time they've felt the iron heel, to use Jack London's book title, come down upon them. And that's a radicalizing thing when you see it for the first time, when you experience it for the first time, when you feel like the hand of the state or the fist of the state sometimes literally punch you in the face. That's a radicalizing moment. When you see what the state forces are capable of, or when they turn fascist forces loose on you, that's a radicalizing moment. It's a moment where, for some people, it will take them in a more revolutionary direction. For some people, it will terrify them and they'll scuttle back into the shadows again. But again, we're going through a radicalization process with these students. And yeah, some of them are going to come from pretty elite, even bourgeois backgrounds. But again, like when the system reaches a point of crisis, even elements of the bourgeois themselves, particularly maybe the younger generation or some of the more, shall we say, far-sighted elements, will start to rebel themselves. And the system that we live within, the imperialist system, is in a deep crisis. So you are going to get more bourgeois kids and upper petty bourgeois kids start to rebel. And this happens every time the system goes into crisis. And the reason why we as communists must see this as a good thing is because plenty of good revolutionaries from over the last 2 centuries have come from the bourgeoisie themselves and have become rebels against their own class. Friedrich Engels himself being, of course, perhaps the most prominent example. But if you get this combination of even the petty bourgeois and bourgeois, or elements within them, starting to rebel, and that combines with a raising of the level of class consciousness of the proletariat, you get a situation where you start to have the combustible elements that will form a potential revolutionary moment coming. And this is why one of the reasons, the big reasons why these protests are a very important thing. Now, I've seen a lot of commentary from various people who will remain nameless that and saying things that, to be honest, and criticisms here of some of the points of view I'm going to outline are also directed at things I've said in the past. So a few years ago, you might be familiar with this if you're a long-time listener to this program, I was being quite dismissive of protests. I was being quite cynical about student protest in particular, because I've been on enough of them, and I had reached the point where I was feeling like there was nothing more to be done with them. And then you see something like this and you have to recalculate, and you have to say to yourself, yes, this protest will have myriad contradictions. There will be all kinds of political forces involved with this, with which I, as a Marxist-Leninist, will be in disagreement with. There will be all kinds of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology on display from some of those involved with which I would disagree. I will disagree. But again, like, if you make your response to these protests about the problems you have with some of the points of view within them, or you have with some of the forces within them, or some of the individuals and organizations that are associated with them, then you are missing the point. And again, that's a criticism I can direct at things I've said in the past as well. It's important to recognize that. If you're saying it's that, well, I don't want to be associated with this because some of these students are into IDPOL, or some of them are into X, Y, or Z, again, you're missing the point. Look at the response that the bourgeois is carrying out here, which is within a few days, they immediately turn to brute levels of state violence, unleashing of fascist mobs, non-stop hysterical propaganda in their press, sitting senators demanding that these students are subjected to a gigantic amount of violence or vigilante violence or being run over. That's all Tom Cotton, by the way. Those are all things that he said. And you have to look at this, look at the way that the bourgeois in the United States are going absolutely mad about this, and you have to draw your conclusions, which is that even with all the contradictions that will be within these protests, they represent something which is an important step, which is it's showing that the bourgeois and their institutions themselves are starting to fray, that they are reacting more and more. They were, if not ruthlessly, then more in a more and more violent fashion, because they are feeling more insecure. Again, their colonial project in the Middle East is facing failure. They're facing defeat in Ukraine. They are looking like they're not going to be able to carry off whatever maneuver they're going to try in Taiwan against China. They're facing defeat and setbacks almost everywhere. They're clinging on to Javier Milei as a win. So this is a system which is in a great deal of crisis. This is a ruling class which is recognizing that it's in a crisis but can't get itself out of it. It's too, because the system's there, and this ruling class is too rotten, and they're panicking and lashing out all over the place. And these are the calculations we need to make. These are the factors we need to build into our analysis of these protests, you see. And again, like reacting with weary cynicism and disdain, I don't think is the proper way to go about this. Yes, again, there will be contradictions. Yes, there will be forces within these protests with which we may have any number of disagreements, but we have to recognize their importance. We have to recognize that there's a tremendous potential for radicalization in a positive and, dare I say it, communist direction amongst many of them, amongst many of those people involved. And we need to be ready to step up and actually provide the guidance that the people who are going through this radicalization process will ultimately need. Because when I was going through a radicalization process 20 years ago now, I would have benefited enormously from actually discovering a proper Marxist-Leninist analysis when I was 20. I didn't. I discovered various forms of Trotskyism and proceeded to waste another decade in the wilderness, longer in actual fact, chasing shadows, which is ultimately what Trotskyism provides you with. So sitting there and sneering and saying, "Oh, I'm not having anything to do with this. I've seen it all before." Again, reassess, comrades, if you're feeling that way, I would say. And again, examine the response of the ruling class, examine where the ruling class has got itself to, examine the crisis of the system, and ask yourself again, is your cynicism the proper response? I would argue, no. I would not seek to say that this was the student protests are the automatic way to revolution. No, far from it. I've been to far too many myself to fall for that particular delusion. But what I'm saying is these protests represent a certain escalation in what's becoming a global anti-imperialist struggle. The leaders of the axis of resistance in the Middle East, or West Asia, if you prefer, recognize the importance of them. The Yemenis recognize the importance of them. Hezbollah do. The Palestinian National Liberation Forces do. The Iranians do. And so, at the very least, we should consider that they think it's important to be an important factor in our consideration as well. Right, I've spoken for quite some time now, so I'm going to go through some of the comments here, and I know there's quite a lot of comments here, so I'm probably not going to get through all of them. Yepex, you said you sent me a couple of emails. Okay, I will double check in the inbox then. If I've not replied to you, then it's because I've been running around doing various other things. Right, so let's see where we are. So, Yepex says, I'd like to hear a discussion how you have no freedoms in the Imperial Core, only privileges. Interesting point. I will come back to that in the future. Dan Kovalik joins us and is enjoying the program. Good to have you with us, Dan. Thomas says both Tony Blair and George W. still continue to make fools of themselves the more they talk about current events. Well, the longer they're around, the better. We might get to put them on trial yet. Okay, Gonzalo joins us from Madrid. That's good to have you with us. Ben says, I read from 3 different sources today that Yemen's Houthis hit a tanker 600 kilometers away in the Arabian Sea, raising concerns, meaning Yemen has twice the range of Ukraine. Well, Yemen is, well, the most populous part of Yemen is governed by a national coalition which is backed by the masses. When you've got the masses on your side, you're capable of all manner of creativity. Yemen is run by a revolutionary nationalist government with, again, the backing of and the active involvement of the masses. Ukraine is a squalid dictatorship run by compradors, which is entirely reliant on US imperialism now for armaments and funding. Such a situation, which is, of course, where the masses are either sullen or alienated from this system, that does not breed creativity. Resistance and fights for liberation breed creativity. Becoming a slave of imperialism just means being a slave and the destruction of your nation. I mean, I'm shorthanding my explanation there, but I think the creativity of the masses is the key in both cases. Thomas asks, is Joe Biden the Tsar Nicholas II of our day? I think Joe Biden makes Tsar Nicholas II look like, well, some sort of genius, to be honest. Joe Biden is exactly the man of the moment, though. Trump will be as well, because Trump ain't that much better in terms of he's funnier, but I don't think he's that much far behind. He's that far behind Biden in terms of his understanding of the world. In fact, their understanding of the world is fairly similar. When Biden had all his marbles, you compare him to Trump's politics, not all that much different. Yep. In answer to Ben's question, do you say slave trading in Ukraine like in Libya? Yeah. My God, this finale is really grim. Well, this is the way it's always been. I mean, I did want to say a little bit more about propaganda, but I've been talking for quite some time. Was the propaganda always this crude, or is it just that they've got their propagandists have got dumber? It's a combination of the fact that we do have the ability to, debunk things in real time now. So, for instance, like Max Blumenthal's debunking of the October 7th mass rape claims, that wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago. So it's that the proletariat has tools at its disposal which can easily debunk things more quickly now. The second point is that the quality of the propaganda has gone down. Like they're investing a lot in it, but a lot of it's just getting leached off into various sort of parasitic ways. But like their monopoly, the absolute monopoly that they used to have on things has gone, and that's the biggest factor here. That, and of course the material benefits that the working class did receive for a while in the imperialist countries, those are all gone now. So the gap between the rhetoric and the reality is too big. So like they keep saying to you, to draw on something from Voltaire, that you live in the best of all possible worlds. But again, for most working class people in the United States or Britain now, their gap between the rhetoric and the reality is just too big. So they might not be drawing communist conclusions yet, but the reason why the bourgeois press has its viewership and readership falling apart is because people just see, they can look inside their bank accounts at the end of the month and see how little's in there, and the condition which their communities are in. And they can see just how big a gap there is between Joe Biden going, I got the greatest economy in 200,000 years, man, and the reality of like a crumbling city, no industries left, mass unemployment, mass poverty, bankruptcies all over the place, drugs, crime problems, etc., etc. People aren't stupid. They might not draw all the communist conclusions just off their own bat, but they can see and understand their own conditions of life. And that is the biggest factor as to why the propaganda is working. In terms of the grim finale, which Ben mentions, I think it's always been this way. I think like when a country gets brought into imperialist rule, this has always happened. Like the reduction of the population to the status of slaves or near slaves is part of it. It's just now we get to see it. We get to see the slave markets in Libya. You get to see or find out about the slave trading in Ukraine. But again, like it's becoming more glaring because, again, as the system decays, like the facades all collapse. And again, beyond the facades lie ultimately the path to fascism. Ian Foster says the fragile veil of liberal rights are quickly being ditched, fascist methodology resurrected to manage the deepening crisis. That's correct. Potted Rodent says, honestly, I see the word communist thrown out every corner as a nastier insult. Doesn't actually get thrown around that much here. I mean, you may be in the US, so it may be different there, but they're more likely to throw the words Nazi or Islamist around here. Beju says, it's supremacist ideology manifest. Why show any respect for the oppressed when you believe you're superior? Very true. Thomas says, I wish politicians would read history and stop bringing Nazis all the time. Try Leopold II or Winston Churchill, other bad guys in history that were atrocious. Well, they can't bring those up because they admire both of the latter. And they actually admired the Nazis for quite a long time as well. The Nazis are just a unifying point for them because it's the only war in British history that attracts very little controversy in terms of the understanding of it. All the others do, which is why they don't mention a lot of the post-1945 wars. But it's the one they're able to portray the British Empire as being on the right side of. I would argue that it wasn't. It was doing various things that involved fighting the Nazis, but for reasons of for reasons of defense of empire, not for any want for liberation or investment in liberation. Jeremy says, isn't Ukraine a world leader in the sex trade? Well, it's one of the global centers of sex trafficking. But another one, of course, the recipient of a lot of sex trafficked women and children is, of course, Israel. So it's this global triangle of horror between Ukraine, Kosovo, and Israel when it comes to the sex trade. Netanyahu response to the ICC. Right, I need to catch up on that. Right, I'm going to scroll down. If I miss anything and you want me to pick up on it, let me know. Jenny says, the nascent Nazi regime between the two world wars were funded by in great amounts by Ford, General Motors, Pew, Mellon, Remington, DuPont, etc. Yeah, as Gabriel Rockhill has and others have chronicled. Hitler was a big investment for US and British capitalism because, again, they saw him as the man who would stop communism by destroying the most important communist party at that time outside of the USSR, which was the Communist Party of Germany. It was a deliberate investment to annihilate the most advanced elements in the German working class. Errol says, also vis-a-vis calling people Nazis, Putin is allegedly a Nazi whose brother was killed by Hitler at the siege of Leningrad. Figure that one out. You're not meant to. It's not meant to make any sense. Again, as I said, it's just meant to trigger visceral responses, not based on logic or analysis, which is how propaganda of the imperialist works. It was Robert Kennedy that went after the Teamsters Union. That's correct, Grassy Knoll. Thomas said, I saw undercover cops antagonize the protesters. That's correct. Undercover cops and various other provocateurs. It's true. Right. Just going through various comments here, trying to catch up on things. Okay. President Jesus says, I got the feeling watching the UCLA protests, a lot of kids were just blowing off steam. Well, maybe. I mean, the reason why people go to protests is multifaceted, always is. But there's also, I mean, Americans, correct me if I'm wrong, certainly it's true here, the underlying contradictions in our societies are getting more pronounced, and therefore there is going to be a radicalization involved. So Thomas makes the correct point that Fidel Castro started being a college protester against their dictatorship. Yeah, I mean, Fidel was the son of not a major landowner, but certainly a minor landowner, Fidel's father came from Spain as a Spanish, I think he was a Spanish officer who got awarded land in Cuba. So again, rebellions of the children of the petty bourgeois or the bourgeois can lead them into revolutionary directions. Don't dismiss it. Potted Rodent says we can't expect purity even within a protest. That's on the correct side of history. Yeah, don't expect purity anywhere you go right now. Just be prepared to maximize the openings that are there. Thomas says Ben Shapiro, Tim Pool, Morning Joe, and Bill Maher are all together against the working class, and they always were. Yeah, and Joe Rogan will be, as somebody pointed out on the Telegram group, Joe Rogan will be with the protests on one show, then he'll smoke a different variety of weed, and he's against them on another. So it depends which day it is for him. Slava says it's like during COVID, some leftists didn't want to protest mandates because they didn't want to be associated with the right wing. It's a very good point. When I started going to the anti-mandate protests, I mean, I was going amongst people who, some of whom thought that the mandates and the lockdowns were communism. And I got denounced by people who had previously worked with me because they said I'd gone it was on the path to becoming a reactionary. So again, just because there were people associated with the anti-lockdown protests, did it mean that the lockdown protests were automatically bad and that lockdowns and vaccine mandates and various other things didn't have a negative impact on the working class? No. The left in Britain and the United States failed to analyze this properly as a manifestation of class war, which, of course, all of these things are, and therefore got the response to it disastrously wrong and left the whole thing in the hands of libertarians and various others. But again, it was the right decision for those of us to attend those protests and interact with them, even though there was thousands of people there who didn't have a damn thing in common with us on an ideological level. But again, I learned a lot through going to those protests and engaging with those people. Perhaps I did some decent work there, maybe, but it's certainly not a decision I regret. Search and Research says the fact that these student protests, that's very correct. They do have very specific demands, which the universities will never meet. But again, the reason for raising the demand is to popularize it and raise the level of consciousness of those who read about it. And then when the university fails to meet those demands, as they are always going to, then you have the opportunity to take, again, the consciousness raising further. Jeremy says there are a lot of students in US universities who have the wisdom of being from Palestine and from around the world. In fact, that's true. Hobb says, mostly off topic, but speaking of propaganda, can you recommend a book or two for debunking myths around famine in the USSR in the 30s? Tried discussing with a Holocaust historian I know and got called a genocide denier. Well, sounds more of a propagandist than a historian. But the books that you can rely on for that, there's the studies of the so-called, I mean, you're talking of the so-called Holodomor, right? The studies by the United States academic Mark Tauger are good for this. There was a couple of studies that he did in the, I think it was in the 90s or the early 2000s, which studied the collectivization process and what was actually going on with the land reforms and how real the famine was. And there's a lot of good stuff there. I'll post some more stuff up on the various different social media channels over the next couple of days on that question. Slava says these protests are like the unions, not enough on their own, but an important step, and that is true. Thomas asks if Israel gets through with their invasion of Rafah, will that lead to full-blown riots in the West? It's an interesting one. I would say also first of all, it's very questionable whether they would actually get their invasion of Rafah done without significant casualties and possible defeat. So there's that as well. We'll see. I mean, I don't want to make too many predictions on this. I think other things are going to go on as well. Bear in mind, as all of this is going on, the Russians are pushing ahead with advances in Ukraine, which are going to be very important. So there's multiple crises facing the imperialists right now, of which Israel is one of them. So I'll come back to that question because I'm going to draw things to a close in a moment or two. I'm glad you enjoyed the Biden impression. Jenny says or asked, what do you think about the Green Party candidate Jill Stein? She seems well-intentioned, but the Green Party in the United States is a disaster area, and her campaign is going to go nowhere. It'll go slightly further than the Cornel West campaign, who has distinguished himself by an ability to drive whatever potential was there completely out of his campaign and completely destroy it, so he can preserve his place on the cocktail circuit. But no, I don't think there's much potential in the American Green Party, just as all Green parties are absolute fucking shit, to be honest. Do I have any opinions on Caleb Morpin's CPI? Asks Michael. Well, I mean, I think that he and his organization have done quite a bit of valuable work in popularizing certain aspects of communism. If you're asking for a more thoroughgoing critique, though, I mean, I have disagreements with Morpin on a number of things. I find his attempts to combine Christianity and Marxism to be eclectic in a negative sense. I don't think that that's something that I regard as possible, combining the two. There's other elements I could go into, but if I started on that, I'd want to do more preparation work, so I was being as accurate as possible in my criticisms. So yes, like many other organizations, he does some valuable work, and I have some points of disagreement with him. Frank says the imperialists' biggest success was to make the word communism a bad word. Well, yeah, for a while, Frank, but we will get over that. Brian Singer and Brett Ratner are streaming in Israel. That's true. Brett Ratner, hack film director, sex offender, Israeli citizen now. Right. Okay. Yes, Slava mentions the other book, which is Douglas Tottle, Fraud, Famine, and Fascism. That's a good book debunking the Holodomor. So yeah, Hob, yeah, Slava gave you a good answer to the question there. Right. Okay. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening because I need to be up early tomorrow. But I'll be back with you tomorrow at the slightly earlier time. Thanks to all 320 of you watching live. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. This will be up in audio form on the Patreon tomorrow. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. And we will keep track of this and probably pick up on it again tomorrow. But there are many other things and many other crises of facing imperialism that we need to catch up with too. Again, thanks for tuning in. I'll be back with you again in the next 24 hours.